as we finish off this unit on appetite regulation, hopefully it is quite clear that appetite regulation is incredibly complex, and there are a lot of things going on both internally and as far as how we respond to our environment and the various cues in our environment that can promote a higher level of motivation towards and overall feeding in some people compared to others. This diagram again shows some of that complexity, but again doesn't even wrap it all together as well. There are so many things going on, from how we interpret the signals of the foods in our environment, how we link that together with our memories of food, what we've learned about food, how different times of day can invoke patterns of eating, how our sensitivity to reward can also impact our desire to eat, and how internal states are also communicating with our appetite center via a bunch of different peptides that communicate with the brain about what's going on in our fat cells and our digestive tracts, etc. And then you add emotions and mood and triggers and all these other things to the mix as well. And it is so clear to me after doing this unit why, just eat less is terrible advice for people. Because when you tell people to just eat less, you are not considering the complexity of their own relationship with food and how different that relationship with food might be compared to someone else, compared to you, and how those differences in relationship with food are impacted by all sorts of physiological, anatomical, conceptual, behavioral, environmental, etc. factors. So, like I said, appetite regulation is hella complex, and although we do have control over our food intake, we might have less control than we thought we did. Okay, so as we've talked about in this unit, homeostatic mechanisms, these are all like the feedback via peptides like CCK and GLP-1 and leptin and ghrelin and peptide YY, which I didn't talk about as much. How when we talk about homeostatic appetite, we're talking about how the brain is receiving information about what's going on in the body, about do we need energy? Do we need nutrients? What do we need? Right? The brain is receiving messages that are reporting back from other parts of the body about internal states, so the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, can promote a drive to eat or a drive to not eat. And genetic, biological factors and a bunch of other factors as well can really alter that signaling in certain people. We talked about how, like, for instance, MC4R receptor deficiencies, how POMC deficiencies, how leptin resistance, how all these different things can potentially make that sensing very different in some individuals versus others. Okay, and then to add another layer on to appetite regulation, we have this non-homeostatic aspect of appetite regulation, where other things like mood, reward, learning, memory, how we are interpreting the signals from our external environment, including how we're interpreting the signals from the people in our internal environment, how those can impact our eating behaviors, right? And these are influenced by a wide range of often neurological constructs like reward, learning, memory, emotional states, etc. Okay? And then some of these stimuli and some of these kind of networks that influence appetite might be overactive in some individuals with obesity. And I wrote chicken or egg there because, the question is, does obesity promote changes in these neural pathways, or do differences in these neural pathways promote obesity, or is the relationship bidirectional as we've often seen? Okay. So again, something else to remember, and that's really shown on this last slide as well, you can't separate homeostatic and non-homeostatic appetite. They influence each other, right? So for instance, if you are receiving signals from your internal states telling you are depleted in energy and nutrients, and so that's going to promote hunger, right? That eat drive, that orexigenic drive in your hypothalamus. Okay, so you're hungry, and you're in an environment where you're surrounded by your favorite foods, that you have deep memories that make you feel loved, and you have a reward drive to seek out those foods, right? And you have good memories of those foods. And, those two things together, even though you might be trying to restrain your eating behaviors, those different factors together can promote an even higher drive to consume. If you're hungry, plus you're surrounded by food, that can promote an even higher drive to consume. So again, it's hard to tease out non-homeostatic versus homeostatic appetite because there are so many overlaps. Okay? And then something you hear a lot more of these days is this concept that obesity is a disease of the brain. And hopefully over the last 3 units, including the genetics and the epigenetics unit, this kind of hopefully has added some of the evidence base for making such a statement like that, which a lot of people have trouble with, right? Because some of the differences, again, in neuroanatomy, in neurophysiology, in particular, but beyond that as well, in endocrine signaling as well, some of those differences can promote significant differences in food intake patterns. And we're not even talking about physical activity, just in food intake patterns, which can increase the propensity for obesity in some people than others. Okay. And again, there's genetic linkages with this and there's epigenetic linkages with that. So I think one thing I want to stress is that we like to give blame. We like to blame the individual a lot when it comes to differences in eating behaviors. But is it your fault that maybe you're born with these genetic changes? Is it your fault that you have these emotional dysregulation patterns that are maybe based on some things you went on in your childhood, or you never were taught proper coping mechanisms, because we're not taught those things, right? So hopefully this has helped us take some of the blame away from our perceptions of obesity. But that said, and I want to make this clear, just because our physiology and our anatomy and our genetics might predispose to a higher energy state, a propensity for obesity and weight gain, that doesn't mean someone's necessarily going to gain weight, right? And we know how much the environment impacts things as well. And I don't want you to, if you're someone that struggles with your weight, I don't want you to listen through this material and be like, well, there's nothing I can do. I don't want to promote that either. I want us to understand that there are things that are in our control and there's things that are less in our control. But I also, I believe in being empowered, and I believe in accepting what we can't change and also working with what we have. And I believe that if someone has struggled with food intake and with their perceptions around their weight, right? That there are ways to develop a very healthy relationship with food, with exercise, and with your body. I 100% believe that. Okay. But the messages out there that just blame the individual and tell us just to eat less, those are not helping. What's important is to apply the right strategy for the particular person. And each of those strategies are going to work differently in different people. Right? If someone has an emotional eating situation, telling them to count calories, that's probably not going to help. Telling them to weigh themselves every day, that's probably not going to help. Maybe it does, but maybe not. Maybe it makes things worse, right? And for someone that is very influenced by the foods in their environment, right? Maybe we're not going to tell them again to count calories or to, go on the keto diet or whatever other diet that might be recommended, right? Maybe for that individual, we try to manage the triggers that are out there, right? Or we promote cognitive strategies that help us reevaluate our environment and to try to choose differently, because our brains are plastic. We can change things. We can change our thoughts. We can, to a point, change our emotions as well, right? But this takes work. And if we keep staying in this place of just blaming the individual and not appreciating the human experience and how difficult it is and how different it is for different individuals, and that doesn't really get us anywhere either. Okay. And that said, and kind of we're moving on in this course towards a discussion about treatments for obesity. Lifestyle approaches are our first approaches to obesity, right? We do recommend strategies that help promote an energy deficit through hopefully reducing food intake and increasing physical activity. But again, we want to tailor those to the individuals. But even still, at the population level, when we put people through behavioral lifestyle strategies, they only promote so much weight loss in individuals with obesity, right? They only typically promote as much as 5% weight loss at the population level. Obviously, individuals can be different. We all know stories of people that have lost hundreds of pounds. But if we're looking at like what happens in intervention studies, the results are actually a lot lower than you might think, okay? That doesn't mean like we give up, right? There's absolutely things we can do, but what I'm arguing is that that's why there is this push for also having pharmaceuticals that, for the most part, what most pharmaceuticals do with obesity is they change appetite levels. That's what all of them do that I can think of, right? With the exception of orlistat, right? Most of them are changing, GLP-1, or they're affecting appetite pathways in the reward system in the case of Contrave. Okay, so pharmaceuticals can help bridge the gap, and bariatric surgery can bridge the gap too. Okay, but that's why it's important to have an individualized approach and to work with people to figure out what treatment strategy is best for that. Because not everyone can afford pharmaceuticals, and they have side effects, often like gastrointestinal side effects that might be undesirable. And bariatric surgery here in Canada, the average wait time is about 2 years. And some people really might not want that or not be a good candidate for that, right? And if you're in another part of the world, those can also be very expensive, right? Prohibitively expensive. So well, that's why we start this whole course with the concepts of weight bias and the concepts of complexity, because there's a lot of things to consider. And hopefully, at the very least, we have moved away from the narrative that the treatment for obesity is just to eat less and exercise more, right? Because this does not account for individual differences in anatomy and physiology, and it definitely doesn't account for the complexity of appetite regulation, which hopefully we've helped to establish in this unit. Okay, so in the last part of the course, this I would say is the hardest module of the semester. In the last part of the course, we are going to move on into behavioral strategies, pharmaceutical strategies, and bariatric strategies that could potentially help someone manage their weight. So I will see you then.